Mr. President, how will you help make a drug-free America so I can feel safe walking out on the streets that no one's going to come up and ask me, would you like to buy some drugs?
One thing I can do is to speak out. Another thing I can do is to hire a person to be our national drug czar. You have to have a strong education program in the schools. You have to have a strong program in the communities to keep the streets safe. And you have to have a strong enforcement program designed to break those people who are bringing drugs into our country in large quantities.
Mr. President, how will you help make a drug-free America so I can feel safe walking out on the streets that no one's going to come up and ask me, would you like to buy some drugs?
All I can tell you is that drugs have affected my family. I hate what they are doing to America and to children's futures. And I'm going to do what I can to fight it through education, through treatment, through opportunities for safety on the streets, and through trying to go after the people who are really causing the problems.
I think most of the crime comes from dope. I mean, that's what most of the people that are on the two crimes are on.
A lot of it is related to drugs. Something like 3 out of every 4 crimes is now related to drugs. And something else in President Clinton's plan relates to that. For the first time, he's making the person in charge of the war against drugs a member of his cabinet with the authority direct from him to coordinate this war against drugs in a new way.
I burnt myself out on marijuana. I took a wood-burning kit, which is similar to a soldering iron, and I burned the word alone into my arm. Part of me wanted to die because I imagined that if I was dead, I could somehow see out of my casket if anybody was at my funeral, if anybody was crying, who was there. That's how, like, sick I was. That's how lonely I felt. Marijuana got me kicked out of my house. My mother overheard a phone conversation and threw me out of the house. She constantly asked me, Russell, what's wrong? What's the matter with you? She said, stop getting high. That's what's the matter with you. Stop hanging out with them losers. That's what's the matter with you. Go to school. Maybe you'll feel better. But of course, I didn't listen to her. I regret it.
Marijuana, you know, cost me a lot of things. I mean, I used to be a straight-A student, you know. I was liked by all the neighbors, you know. Never really caused any trouble. I was always a good kid, you know, growing up. You know, it was all right. Before I knew it, I was getting thrown out of my house. I mean, it's crazy to think what really happened to me. I was a good kid, straight-A students. Next thing I know, I'm getting thrown out of my house, and it's like, you know, I just became a total loser. I would do just about anything to get pot. I stole jewelry from my mom, you know, stole her money. I was doing a lot of shoplifting, you know. My mom would just be like, you know, where are you going today? And I would just lie to her dead in her eye, lied to her face every day. Just came home one day from school and my bags were packed. And she said, if you keep smoking, you're gone.
I loved marijuana. I did it every day and every night, all day and all night. I'm a musician. I swore to myself that I would never sell any of my musical equipment, my guitar equipment, you know, my studio equipment. I would never sell that for anything. And when I was in Sam Ash on Route 4 in Jersey, hawking guitar equipment so I could cross the GWB and go into Manhattan and cop marijuana, I knew I had a problem.
If I hadn't stopped smoking pot, right now I'd probably be dead. Once I started smoking pot, I didn't care anymore. I didn't care about any consequences or what would happen to me. So I just started taking other drugs on top of it, you know. And I ended up, I was in a hospital. I overdosed. You know, I had an IV in my arm, strapped down to a hospital bed with a heart monitor. I said that night, I'll never do drugs again, I'll never smoke pot, I'll never do nothing. I woke up, I sold my mother's VCR to go get pot.
I'll be all right. I'll just smoke a little weed here and there, you know. I told her, Ma, don't worry about it, I'll be okay. I only smoke weed once in a while, you know. I told her, oh, well, a lot of my friends, yeah, they're the problem ones, not me. I'm not like them, Ma. I just hang out with them because they're cool. That's why I always thought, you know, that I wasn't as bad. I never thought that I was just like them, or ever gonna be like them. After a while, I became just, you know, just like them or worse.
If I hadn't stopped smoking pot, right now I'd probably be dead. I was just like everyone else. I was a normal kid, and I used to say, pot's never gonna do anything to me, or getting high isn't gonna do anything to me. I'm in control, and you know, I used to think I was a tough guy. And I was just like everybody else. I used to watch the commercials, and I used to say to myself, that'll never be me, you know, and it is me.
What should I do? Take it or not take it? Guess I could try. He's doing it. Well, maybe I can handle it. If I don't do this, I won't have any friends. I'll just sit alone at lunch. Here we go, only 2 people away. Look, he looks fine. She said no. I'm a fool for not taking it. Okay, here it comes. I'll make a decision right now. Don't worry about them.
So you and your best friend got into a fight. You didn't make JV basketball. Julie doesn't like you anymore. She likes gym now. Your teacher says you're not concentrating. Hey, how's that part-time job? What part-time job? If you think pot's gonna make your problems go away, you got another problem.
I look different.
I wish people liked me more.
Why do I have to be so?
Why do I have to be like this?
Strange. I have these thoughts.
I wish I were
Taller, cooler, stronger.
Everybody else gets high.
I just don't want to.
I think a lot of kids smoke pot.
I feel like I'm the only one who doesn't.
Why do I have to be so
Different.
different? Maybe we're not as different as we think.
When I was high on pot, I was flirting with this guy, and I didn't even know who he was. I didn't know his name, and we ended up having sex with each other, and I felt like, why am I doing this to myself, and what's going on with me? I felt very ashamed, and I felt embarrassed, and I felt dirty. Marijuana, it won't get you nowhere.
For me, I lost everything that I had. My parents, my house, everything. Just because it all started with marijuana. And I said I was just only gonna smoke marijuana, but it didn't work that way. If kids think that marijuana is gonna help them with their problems or help them be a part of and do things that other kids are doing, I would just say that it just makes things worse. Marijuana is not worth it.
The following program is a special presentation of ABC News. Illegal drugs, marijuana, cocaine, heroin. They're a plague across America, a disease spreading crime and violence into every corner of our society.
This is a deadly and poisonous activity. People should be in prison for long periods of time for doing it.
Each year, America spends billions of our tax dollars trying to win the war on drugs. Policing our borders, arresting the pushers, imprisoning the users.
The war on drugs has turned into a war on our people. We almost can't do it worse than we are today. There's got to be a better way.
In Europe, they think they've found a better way. In Holland, you can buy marijuana as easily as a cup of coffee. And junkies can buy heroin from pushers right on the streets. And in Great Britain, doctors prescribe heroin to addicts who just can't quit. They believe it cuts crime and reduces the harm drugs cause to society. Could it work here?
You will never persuade the citizens of this country, never, that they should legalize drugs.
But some Americans say that we're losing the war, that we must search for new answers. Is it time for a change?
If that means providing him with heroin or morphine or injectable methadone, then we should do that.
America's war on drugs. Searching for solutions with Catherine Cryer.
Good evening. Tonight, we'll take a very different look at the war on drugs. There's not much disagreement that we're losing it. What is just as striking as our lack of success is the lack of any widespread public debate about alternatives to our current policies. Our purpose tonight is not to advocate any specific policy change. Rather, it is to open up the discussion, to look at some very different, you might even say radical approaches to fighting drugs. Approaches which are based on experiments currently underway in other countries. Approaches which might help America wage its fight against drugs more successfully.
Search warrant! Search warrant! Police officer! Down on the ground! Police officer!
It is the longest running war in U.S. history.
Put your hands on your head!
A front line moving through the front yards of America.
Shut up!
Searched and seized and sent to jail, nothing has stopped Americans from using illegal drugs. A problem targeted by presidents for more than a generation.
Total war against public enemy number one in the United States, the problem of dangerous drugs.
I believe they're a devastating affliction on our society and ought to be eliminated as much as we can.
Just say no to drugs.
This is crack cocaine.
And until America deals with its drug problem, it cannot deal with its crime problem.
I don't have anything.
On the street, the business of black market drug dealing brings in tens of billions of dollars each year. It has also brought alarming increases in crime and violence, AIDS and addicts, drug-addicted babies, prison overcrowding, and more. And you are paying. The total estimated cost to society for illegal drug use each year, almost $67 billion. Today, there are as many illegal drugs on the streets as ever, and more Americans behind bars for drug violations than ever before, over 300,000. Some are dangerous drug dealers, but many are nonviolent drug users, like Oklahoma auto mechanic Jim Montgomery, a 41-year-old paraplegic with no prior criminal record.
My worst violation, I think, is a speeding ticket. That's about out of hands I get.
Montgomery smokes marijuana, he says, to relieve the pain of his broken back. But Oklahoma police seized his drugs from a pouch behind his wheelchair, and a jury gave him a life sentence for possession with intent to distribute 2 ounces of marijuana, an amount equal to the tobacco in 2 packs of cigarettes.
They attacked me with a vigilance. Accused me of just about being Manuel Noriega's right-hand man. Here's his pot, here's his pipes. He runs a drug house. People, let's get him.
Montgomery is now in prison with a reduced sentence of 10 years, still longer than the average time served in the U.S. for murder.
35 million Americans, 15% of the population smoke marijuana.
Rabin Martin is Jim Montgomery's attorney. He says thousands of drug users are serving long, unjust sentences because Americans mistakenly believe the only place for drug users is in prisons, overcrowded prisons.
When you shove somebody in the front door for possessing 2 ounces of marijuana, and you pop a rapist or a murderer or a child molester out the back door, you know, they don't want to see that, though. They say, this person's a dope dealer, we want him to go to prison, and our minds are closed, and we're not going to think about anything else. We're not going to think about the cost. We're not going to think about the consequences. We're not going to think about who might be released. We're not going to think.
The war on drugs, I regret to say, has turned into a war on our people.
California Superior Court Judge James Gray says America must find alternatives to simply locking up drug users.
You cannot get anything worthwhile by putting drug-dependent people into prison. We don't accomplish anything beneficial, and we spend enormous amounts of money in the effort. And again, I'm convinced that if we were to use the money for treatment instead of incarceration, we'd have fewer people using these drugs tomorrow than are using them today.
Judge Gray is part of a growing movement talking about a radical new drug policy for America, one that includes some form of drug legalization and a government distribution of drugs directly to the junkies who abuse them. If you think the judge is smoking something, think again.
I am a conservative. I've never used this garbage in my life.
And listen to his startling suggestion.
Well, I personally would have a program of the regulated distribution of heroin, cocaine, and marijuana, where people, adults, could go to a government package store and purchase these. You would also have warning labels similar to those of cigarettes. Inside, you would have drug information, treatment information. Hey, are you tired of using this garbage yet? Call 1-800 such and such. We have a treatment program for you.
This is pretty radical stuff.
Nobody advocates the use or abuse of these drugs, but we can reduce the harm that will flow from them enormously.
Judge Gray's idea is just one being debated as part of a controversial new approach called harm reduction, which combines legal and medical strategies. The idea is this: if America cannot win the war on drugs, it should try instead to reduce the harm associated with drug abuse. The main goal is to keep addicts functioning in society. Give them treatment, not punishment. Give them clean needles. Legalize marijuana. And even under supervision, give hardcore addicts their drugs. All of this aimed at keeping drug users away from the black market and drug dealers. And by cutting down the profits of the drug trade, reducing the harm done to the rest of us.
The biggest problem is that the current approach makes it very profitable to distribute drugs at the street level. You got a problem, huh? Yeah, all right, they take care of it.
Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke supports harm reduction. A former prosecutor, Mayor Schmoke has studied the drug problem on the streets, where he says it is critical to eliminate the profits from drug dealing.
Most of the people that are doing all these shootings out here are not folks that have taken the drugs and then gone crazy and started shooting. It's war over money at the street level. And so what I'm suggesting is that we have an approach that takes the profit out of distributing drugs at the street level.
It is one of harm reduction's boldest gambles. Make the government the official distributor of drugs so there will be no profit to make on the street. And with no drug profits, the reasoning goes, there will be no drug dealers.
They would be out of business, and hooray for that. We could do that, and we could focus our attention upon drug education, which does work, and also for drug treatment, which does work. We will be far, far ahead.
But treatment, which is critical for drug abusers, is rarely available. Only about 20% of America's estimated 3 million hardcore addicts can get help.
No violence, that's the big thing. No violence. We can talk as long as we put the guns away, you know what I mean?
In New Haven, Connecticut, a city hard hit by hard drugs, Police Chief Nick Pastor preaches harm reduction to anyone he can.
And my friend, my best friend, died with a needle in his arm. Heroin. You understand?
Pastor believes that by monitoring addicts with treatment and government-supplied drugs, harm and crime will be reduced.
The thing is that I feel good about is that that heroin addict is not preying on society, is not killing somebody, not banging somebody on the head, not breaking into your or my home. They're getting help.
What happens when you have drug abusers on the street that don't want treatment and continue to bring about violence
Yes.
in society?
Lock them up and throw the key away.
But if reformers are to succeed in changing the war on drugs, they will first have to fight a war of words.
If I say, I'd like to talk to you about legalizing drugs tonight, my audience immediately draws conclusions that people have their own sense of, in their own mind, of what legalization means, and you don't get to the next step.
What happens to the person that ends up doing drugs?
In fact, most people believe that any form of legalization would be dangerous to society and would dramatically increase drug use, particularly among children.
You will never persuade the citizens of this country, never, that they should legalize drugs.
William Bennett, national drug czar during the Bush administration, is adamant that the war on drugs is an ongoing battle and that America must never admit defeat.
This is a deadly and poisonous activity. It should be against the law. People should be imprisoned for long periods of time for doing it. It's a matter of right and wrong.
Just because we discuss our options does not mean we condone drug abuse. We can deal with this very significant problem, with these very dangerous drugs, much more promisingly through the medical system and through our social system. We almost can't do it worse than we are today. There's got to be a better way.
Reformers like Judge Gray are looking to Europe, where some countries have already adopted a radically different approach to the war on drugs. And when we come back, we'll take you to a Dutch coffee shop and show you how the legalization of the use of marijuana has become the cornerstone of their approach to fighting the war on drugs. Today, the drug crisis is exploding all over the world, and some European countries, including Italy, Spain, Germany, and France, are searching for new solutions. But nowhere in Europe is this movement for change further along than in Holland, where a policy of punishment has been replaced by a policy of tolerance. This is a coffee shop in the city of Amsterdam. And this is a scene that today could never take place anywhere in the United States. Young people smoking marijuana openly and in public. For almost 20 years, the sale and possession of small quantities of soft drugs, marijuana and hashish, has not been a crime in the Netherlands. Anybody over the age of 16 can buy up to 30 grams, about 15 marijuana cigarettes, without having to worry about being arrested and going to prison. Rob Hessing is chief of police in Rotterdam and a critic of the tough law and order approach used in America.
If one should have the idea that the police or the authorities should solve this problem by law, then they make a big mistake.
The Dutch have long believed that society cannot stop but can only control the illegal use of drugs. They believe there has always been and always will be a problem with addiction, and have rejected America's war on drugs in favor of a broad harm reduction strategy based on tolerance. A strategy that looks at the drug crisis as a health problem and not a criminal problem. And the key to their approach is that policy that legalizes the use of marijuana. Bob Kaiser is head of addiction at the Ministry of Health.
We believe that if young people are interested in taking drugs, with this system they can just buy it in a more or less open atmosphere. There's no secrecy. So they are not forced to get into contact with all criminal figures who are more interested in offering hard drugs to them.
By legalizing the use of marijuana, the Dutch say they have successfully prevented kids from experimenting with hard drugs. And while some studies in America do show that smoking marijuana may lead to the use of other drugs, the Dutch do not believe that marijuana is a gateway, a stepping stone to heroin, cocaine, or amphetamines.
And statistics show that this policy works because the number of hard drug users has stabilized for more than 10 years.
So that's telling you that young people are not moving into
exactly.
that.
The stepping stone theory doesn't work.
The Dutch also spend very little money policing the coffee shop scene because they say there's virtually no crime associated with the use of marijuana. But there are problems, especially in border towns where foreign tourists come to buy soft drugs that are illegal in their countries. The Dutch spend most of their law enforcement budget trying to control the crime and violence associated with their hardcore drug problem. They've even adopted a harm reduction strategy when it comes to their heroin addicts.
A lot of users are not criminal. They are working, have a job, are not unemployed. What we fight is against the dealers, the traffickers, the organized crime, and very hard. We don't hunt the users.
Unlike the United States, in Holland, the war on drugs is waged almost entirely against the big drug dealers. Addicts can buy and sell up to a half gram of heroin, cocaine, or amphetamines, and the police will look the other way. If I'm a hard drug addict and I am not stealing to support my habit, I've got a job.
Exactly.
Is anybody going to arrest me?
No.
No?
The usage is not prohibited by law. Drug usage is not illegal in the Netherlands.
You've still got addicts on the street
Yes.
needing drugs from the black market.
Yeah.
How have your policy changes lowered the crime rate?
Because we know the market, we know the people, and we are not only repressive as a police organization, but try to help the drug addicts to find their problems, to look for solutions, and to try to get any result.
The police say that by knowing the market and the people, they can keep addicts out of trouble and reduce crime. They believe that you cannot force hardcore junkies to stop taking drugs until they want to. The police have worked with Dutch policymakers to develop what's probably the most important part of their harm reduction strategy, a comprehensive drug treatment program that focuses on the addict and public health. Ton Quat is the coordinator of all drug treatment programs in Rotterdam.
It's not one miracle policy. You have to take a lot of small steps to find different solutions for different kinds of people. Small steps, custom-made solutions for people who can relate to that solution.
The Dutch began by trying to help even the most desperate junkies. There are almost 25,000 users here. And even though it's hard to draw comparisons between the number of heroin addicts in Holland and the United States, it is clear the Dutch spend a higher percentage of their $100 million drug budget trying to prevent addicts from harming themselves as well as others. One of the programs they've launched is free needle exchange to stop the spread of AIDS. HIV infection is the biggest health problem in the heroin community, and one of the main reasons, the Dutch say, they expanded their harm reduction strategy.
So if you put in enough clean syringes and needles, people don't have to use dirty needles. So the risk of getting HIV is lessened. And I think the Dutch number will prove it.
Since the needle exchange program was first introduced almost 10 years ago, the HIV infection rate among injecting drug users in cities like Amsterdam has dropped from 11% to 4% and is now one of the lowest in the world. But Holland's harm reduction strategy doesn't only focus on keeping its junkies healthy. There are many drug treatment programs all over the country to help addicts kick their habits.
We have a system of free methadone. Everybody who wants can get free methadone. The effect is that people are seen very regularly by the healthcare system.
By seeing them nearly every day, we can watch over them. How are they doing? Whenever somebody or anybody is giving the sign of, I want to stop using drugs, we are there. So we can pick them out of our maintenance programs and we could put them in a rehabilitation program.
This too seems to be working. A recent study in Amsterdam shows that many junkies are now in rehabilitation, learning a trade, and that over 75% of the city's heroin addicts are on methadone maintenance, living relatively normal, crime-free lives. But despite these successes, Holland's black market in hard drugs continues to thrive. Cocaine and now crack are causing more violence. And some critics say they don't want to see junkies who openly shoot heroin on the streets. There's certainly the view that Dutch society is very permissive, that it's crumbling from a moral point of view. Is that a fair perspective?
No, it's not.
Why not?
Because it works our system compared with other systems. Of course, we have problems, but I don't believe drug policy will ever be a success story. It's just a matter of keeping the problem within certain limits.
Today, some Dutch policymakers believe their harm reduction strategy doesn't go far enough. That until the laws are changed and all drugs are legalized, the black market trade in drugs, with all its crime and violence, will never go away.
At the end, we have to legalize it because more police, more courts, more prisons, they don't solve the problem. They didn't and they will not.
So the Dutch continue to debate the future of their drug policy and continue to question America's tough law and order approach.
The United States have still this strong belief in the war on drugs. And of course, the United States is a very big, a very powerful country, and the Netherlands is a very small country. So we don't have the illusion to change your policy, but maybe you have the illusion to change our policy.
The Dutch feel pressure to adopt a tougher law and order approach at every international meeting on the drug crisis. So do the British, whose harm reduction strategy even allows doctors to prescribe drugs to addicts. It's called heroin maintenance. In the United States, doctors could go to jail for doing it. In Britain, doctors say it's a weapon critical to winning the war on drugs. How does it work? We'll show you when we come back.
America's War on Drugs, Searching for Solutions, continues with Catherine Cryer.
The British, like the Dutch, are also looking at harm reduction as an alternative to America's war on drugs. They too have a system of free methadone and an extensive needle exchange program. But the British, unlike the Dutch, are also experimenting with a radical approach to treatment called heroin maintenance. It's not for all addicts, but targets a small group of long-term junkies who have repeatedly tried but just can't stop taking drugs.
I romanticised junkies, I suppose, you know, pop stars like Richards and Lennon, but no, at no point did I think, God, in 10 years' time I'm going to be a junkie.
Tim is a hardcore heroin addict. He's 29 years old and has been shooting heroin for over a decade.
You know, on a hit, I'm steady as anything. I'm clear as a bell.
And without it?
Without it, I just turkey, just withdraw. Don't want to know, don't want to talk. Just want to lay on a bed, no energy.
Although he's always worked as a building surveyor, he has spent every penny shooting heroin up his arm. He's tried quitting dozens of times, but has always failed.
Did you ever try methadone?
Yeah, I was doing methadone for quite a few months.
How was it?
It never took the place of heroin.
Why not?
It just hasn't, it's not the same thing. It's like really feeling like a big feed and somebody giving you half a sandwich. You know, it's food and it goes into your stomach, but it hasn't done the trick.
Tim is now one of about 400 heroin addicts in Great Britain who are part of a small experimental treatment program that most of us in America cannot even imagine. It's called heroin maintenance, and it's part of Britain's harm reduction approach to fighting the war on drugs. Dr. Jeffrey Marks is the chief psychiatrist at the Cheltenham Drug Service and one of dozens of doctors who practice heroin maintenance.
Tell me how the program works.
If we have a patient presenting to our clinic who is injecting heroin and who makes it clear that he is not yet ready to stop taking opiate drugs, we are willing to provide for those people controlled amounts of pharmaceutical heroin.
It's called diamorphine, and it comes in several forms. Tablets, liquid, powder, or smokable heroin is given to long-term junkies with the goal of trying to stabilize their addiction. Jeremy Clitheroe is the former head of the National Pharmaceutical Association and one of Britain's leading experts on heroin maintenance. He says there are dozens of studies that show it's the other substances, from brick dust to plaster, used to dilute illegal heroin that destroy the physical health of the addict.
In small doses and in pure composition, heroin is, according to textbook, a remarkably safe drug.
Yes, they are addicted to it and have to have it to feel normal, but you can give somebody heroin for the rest of their lives and it will do them no harm at all. It has no long-term serious side effects at all.
Pharmaceutical heroin has always been legal in Great Britain. It was routinely prescribed to control addiction until the mid-1960s, when the government decided to strictly regulate the practice after doctors were convicted of illegally selling the drug on the black market. The prescribing of pharmaceutical heroin almost ended during this period, and it was not until 1988 and the AIDS epidemic that doctors once again began experimenting with heroin maintenance to help control addiction.
When someone comes into you and says, I am an injectable heroin user, what's to say this isn't someone who simply would like a free ride? Or does it even matter?
It does matter. I think it would be very wrong to give someone like that heroin, in which case we wouldn't give it to them. It has to be someone who can use the program constructively. Right, and now we need to review Tim on the ward.
Yeah.
How's he been?
He is withdrawing quite visibly. I mean, he's
Yes.
suffering, really.
Tim was carefully selected by Dr. Marks as a candidate for heroin maintenance. He was closely monitored by a team of experts as they tried to transition him from street heroin to pharmaceutical heroin.
The dose of heroin that we give isn't a dose that will make them high. We're not giving them a free high. We are giving them just enough heroin to keep the withdrawal symptoms at bay, but to keep them at a state where they're not intoxicated.
I expected it to be a bit of an easier time than the last week's been. The last week's been tough because obviously there's got to be a certain amount of me withdrawing and them seeing to what extent I'm withdrawing and giving me enough heroin to stop me withdrawing, which is what they've done, but it's a pretty painful process.
All addicts who enter the heroin maintenance program at the Cheltenham Drug Service go through this same process of evaluation. It would take Dr. Marks 2 weeks to find the right dose of heroin to stabilize Tim. Today, he's out of the clinic and picking up his prescription each morning at a pharmacy. He's attending weekly therapy sessions and trying to rebuild his life.
Do you sort of see a life cycle of addiction in people?
Oh, there is, without a doubt. People mature out of addiction.
And that's part of the thinking behind our program. We are willing to prescribe heroin to buy time, to get them out of criminal behavior, to get them to be functioning in society, so that when they do come through that cycle, they have a normal life to latch onto.
But what about in the days when you're really having trouble?
David is another of those addicts like Tim who's trying to come through that cycle of addiction and build a productive life. David has been part of Britain's heroin maintenance experiment for over 2 years. He's committed no crimes, bought no heroin on the black market, and is now working part-time in an insurance office. He's prescribed heroin-laced cigarettes called reefers and smokes 5 of these each day.
I'll wake up in the morning and I'll smoke a reefer before I go to work, and I'll get dressed for work, have a shave, get ready, and then I'll smoke another one on my way to work. While I'm at work, it's not too bad because I've got work to do, and I know when I come home at night it's going to be there.
No longer on the street looking for his next fix, David says he's planning for the future, attending college, working toward a degree in nursing.
Because I've had this prescription, I've been able to get my life back in order, so that prescription has given me a second chance. So that's why I think it's important that the heroin prescription should be there.
Many doctors and lawmakers in Great Britain say that heroin maintenance is an important part of their harm reduction strategy. And while there have been no major studies, small anecdotal studies like this one show a 15-fold reduction in criminal convictions amongst the addicts on maintenance, and that the heroin dealer has slowly but surely abandoned the streets.
Doctor, do you consider the program a success?
I do. I have no doubt that it is successful. We have plenty of people who previously we would have called hopeless cases, who would never stop taking drugs, who would never stop committing crimes, and who would probably kill themselves, who have now come off and are leading drug-free lives and who are happy.
But there are critics in Great Britain, critics who say there's no real proof that heroin maintenance works, that some addicts who've been stabilized still buy heroin on the black market, and that others, just like those doctors in the 1960s, routinely sell their prescriptions to make a profit.
Are you worried, though, about the mixed message that don't ever start, but if you do, we in fact will maintain you with your problem?
These are different messages to different parts of the environment and different parts of the community.
But kids are hearing that, don't you
Yes.
think?
They are. We must get the message across to them. The downside of using the drugs is far worse than the short-term pleasurable upside.
Today, other countries are beginning to look at Britain's heroin maintenance strategy. The Swiss are in the middle of a 3-year scientific study involving 700 addicts. And the Dutch, who have already legalized the use of marijuana and hashish, are reviewing plans to launch an experiment of their own. The British, too, are debating the future of heroin maintenance. And even though some government policymakers would like to see tougher anti-drug laws, many of the police on the streets would rather see heroin maintenance greatly expanded. Phil Williams, head of the drug squad in Cheshire County.
We've got a drugs problem in the country, as it is in the rest of the world. Somebody has to do something about it. And this is one method that we found that is working.
Jeremy Clitheroe agrees.
We are now just tapping the reservoir of users. There must be so many more people there who could be helped. My personal view is it's an investment we must make.
A drug treatment center in London is now in the process of setting up its own scientific study on heroin maintenance. The study involves about 125 hardcore addicts and should be completed in about a year. So the question now is, should America be experimenting with heroin maintenance and some of the other harm reduction strategies we've shown you? We'll talk about that when we come back. For decades, there has been a broad American consensus against changing the tough law and order approach to our drug crisis. In part, that's because American policymakers don't believe that harm reduction or heroin maintenance really work, that these policies only encourage addicts to keep on using drugs. Moreover, they believe that America already has the answer on how to cure addiction through our own brand of treatment. This is a group therapy session at Phoenix House, one of the most well-known drug treatment centers in this country. And this is the key to America's drug treatment strategy, getting addicts to stop taking drugs.
You know, you're stuffing a lot of feelings. You need to use your groups, and you need to confront those feelings that you're stuffing.
Here, drug addiction is considered to be symptomatic of other problems. So addicts, heroin, cocaine, amphetamine addicts, are all forced to come to grips with themselves in sessions that are often confrontational.
I suggest you use this game and talk about it. Let it out. Let us know what's going on, or let me know what's going on.
Many do not come by choice. Some have been forced here by parents, others by friends, but most by the criminal justice system. Dr. Mitchell Rosenthal heads Phoenix House. If there is one problem that upsets him almost as much as addiction, it's America's lack of commitment to treatment.
This country should be embarrassed about the fact that it has so little in the way of treatment resources.
What do you say to those people who respond, this is not my life, I don't take drugs, these people are committing crimes, endangering me, lock them up, get them off the street, and I don't want to hear any more about them?
I think those people are right. They should be stopped by locking them up. But what we ought to do is see that prison is the first part of a treatment plan.
But today, few prisoners get treatment, nor do most addicts on the street, because most of the drug budget is spent on our tough law and order approach. And there are other problems. Treatment doesn't always work. Addicts who've gone through it frequently relapse. The success rate at even some of the best treatment facilities is only 25%. Once again, former drug czar William Bennett.
I'm all for effective drug treatment, but one thing I learned for sure from drug treatment is it's best not to get in this in the first place. It's best not to get involved in drugs in the first place. And the way that works, I think, is through prevention efforts. And law enforcement is a very effective kind of prevention effort for most people.
But as we have seen, that tough law enforcement and minimal treatment approach is not working. So some cities are beginning to adopt some of the European experiments in harm reduction.
Morning.
Hello.
In Baltimore, as in Holland, they use methadone maintenance and mobile vans to help addicts stabilize their lives. And in a few cities, like San Francisco, there is free needle exchange so that addicts won't transmit AIDS.
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, great. Drop them in the box.
All attempts to control the harm addicts cause to themselves and others. But these programs are rare. Ethan Nadelman heads the Lindesmith Institute, founded to study alternative solutions to America's drug policy. He is passionate about the need for more tolerance to addicts.
Somehow our war on drugs says that it's immoral to give junkies clean needles, as if the more moral message is to let them get AIDS and die, and before they die, to bring down their children and their lovers and their friends with them. And meanwhile, costing everybody who doesn't use drugs billions of dollars in hospital costs and emergency room costs and what have you.
I don't think we have any data yet that is compelling that needle exchange is making a difference.
But Nadelman says the proof is there. In Holland, as we've already shown you, needle exchange is effective. And a recent study of addicts in New York confirmed it yet again. The HIV infection rate dropped from 6% to 2% for those getting clean needles. If it is so clearly the right thing to do for all of these reasons, why the objections in this country?
Why? Because people focus on the first message. You're giving a junkie a needle to take drugs with. That's a bad thing. Therefore, we shouldn't do it.
Harm reduction experts argue tens of thousands of junkies and former addicts with AIDS and others who have been unknowingly infected by them could have been saved by needle exchange. But as we said, American policymakers don't believe in it. Nor do they believe in this. Great Britain's experimental heroin maintenance program, where addicts like Tim and David are given prescriptions of heroin.
Heroin maintenance is a bust, and any treatment that is looking at fixing a complicated human problem from a pure pharmacologic and drug method, that we're going to fix this mess by adding a drug, is doomed to failure.
And other policymakers believe maintenance could never work here because of America's much larger heroin problem. But Ethan Nadelman is not as negative and feels we too should be experimenting with heroin maintenance.
What we're saying is, show me a junkie who can't quit and who's at risk of AIDS and who's committing crimes. Let's reduce that crime. Let's reduce that AIDS. Let's reduce the vulnerability to disease. Let's try to help him get his life together. If that means providing him with heroin or morphine or injectable methadone, then we should do that.
And like heroin maintenance, this too is hard for Americans to accept. It is the Netherlands' liberal approach to marijuana. American policymakers worry when they see sites like this. After all, if we allow the legalization of small quantities of marijuana, could we be encouraging a future generation of marijuana smokers?
You know, we don't need a drug that makes kids stupider. We don't need this more widely used. This is not our problem, is that our kids are overly smart and we need to destroy their memory.
It's irrational.
Dr. Lester Grinspoon is professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He too used to worry about the dangers of marijuana, but 20 years of research has changed his mind.
But if we accept the fact that people are always going to use something, I would far rather people use marijuana than any of the other drugs.
And yet this country has prohibited marijuana, and one of the main reasons is it's a gateway drug. It's going to lead people to harder drugs.
There is no evidence for that whatsoever. That is another myth about cannabis. It has nothing to do with any inherent property of the drug, that one will go on to use another drug.
Remember, though, there are some studies that suggest marijuana may lead to the use of hard drugs. But other reports, U.S. government reports, have repeatedly come to the opposite conclusion about not only the gateway theory, but marijuana itself.
We also firmly believe that criminalizing the vast majority of users is unjustified and unwarranted.
In 1972, the Schaefer Commission, a blue-ribbon panel of experts appointed by President Richard Nixon, recommended that possession and sale of small amounts of marijuana should no longer be an offense. California adopted that strategy,
and according to this study, saved well over $1 billion in law enforcement costs from 1976 to 1986, and close to another $1 billion since then. But even considering those savings, some believe the Schaefer Commission's recommendations have been purposely ignored by our nation's leaders.
Why is this happening? What's the rationale?
It's a fear of having to admit, well, maybe we were wrong about this. Because once marijuana is legalized, they will look back and they will say, what in the world? Why did we spend so much energy in the 20th century arresting people for marijuana, putting them in jail and so forth? This is less of a problem than alcohol or tobacco by orders of magnitude.
But of course, if there's opposition to legalizing marijuana, can you imagine the reaction to our government distributing hard drugs? That package store plan we told you about earlier.
Supposing government subsidizes drugs so that people can get it cheap, you will then have, I would estimate, 40 to 50 million heavy users of drugs in the United States. That's not a scenario the American people are interested in.
That is real fear-mongering. There is absolutely no information anywhere that says that if we were to make these drugs available under a different system, that everybody would go out and use these drugs. I wouldn't use these drugs. I'm sure you wouldn't either. And if I were going to, I'm sure I'd be using them already.
If drugs were legal, would you run out and begin taking drugs?
No.
Why do we think that the world is different?
There are lots of people in America who live on the margin. There are lots of people in America who live on the margin who would try things were they not fearful that they might get in trouble, the law or their job or something. The temptation to use drugs like this is rather strong in such circumstances.
But the real fear is for America's children. Remember those public service announcements?
You better know what you're jumping into.
For a while, these warnings prepared by the Partnership for a Drug-Free America had great impact.
Want to get high? No way, man.
And the number of kids trying all kinds of drugs declined during the 1980s. But today, with not enough money to teach kids about the dangers of drugs, recent figures suggest that drug use among young kids is up dramatically. So what would happen if drugs were even more available, as Judge Gray has suggested? Wouldn't it lead to more kids experimenting with drugs and make a bad situation that much worse?
Today, we have people that are out there on our high school, junior high school campuses pushing this garbage. The kids know where the drugs are. They're choosing, a lot of them, not to use them. They would continue to choose not to use them under my system. Would some get through? Sure. But we're just trying to reduce this harm. We're certainly never going to get rid of it.
Police, open the door! Police, open the door! Open the door!
It is that fact we'll never completely get rid of drugs. And the crime, the destruction of human lives, the disease that has inspired many to look for new solutions. While supporters of harm reduction do acknowledge there will be an increase in drug use, they still believe we must look at those experiments in Holland and Great Britain.
I believe that we'll end up with safer.
And at the very least, reformers like Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke say we must not repeat the errors of our past.
I think that the war on drugs is domestic Vietnam. And didn't we learn from Vietnam that at a certain point in the war we should stop and rethink our strategy, ask why are we here, what are we doing, what succeeded, what's failed? And we ought to do that with the domestic Vietnam, which is the war on drugs.
At the moment, America shows few signs of rethinking its drug strategy. The government continues to spend more money on law enforcement, more money on building new prisons, more money on fighting the war on drugs. When we come back, some final thoughts. Tonight, we've examined a very different and controversial approach to America's drug problem called harm reduction. Could it work here? The answer is unclear. The European experiments we've shown you are small in number. The cultures are very different from ours. The ultimate benefits of the experiments have not been conclusively evaluated. Yet, as we've seen in each of the countries we visited, law enforcement and medical officials seem convinced that these experiments are working. Again, our purpose tonight is not to advocate any specific policy, but rather to suggest that as we search for solutions, we need to consider all of the alternatives. To simply eliminate some approaches because they may seem at first glance too radical or too different from policies we have followed for decades cannot be in our best interest. Whether the alternative strategies will ultimately work for America is an open question, but it's a question which deserves a fair, spirited, and serious debate. To continue that very discussion, please join us for a special edition of Nightline following your local news. For all of us at ABC News, I'm Catherine Cryer. Thank you for joining us, and good night.
April 6, 1995.
Holland says it's waging a war on drugs. There, you can buy marijuana with your coffee. England says it's fighting the battle, in part by dispensing heroin to addicts. And America? Here, the mere mention of drug legalization sets off a firestorm.
I personally would have a program of the regulated distribution of heroin, cocaine, and marijuana, where people, adults, could go to a government package store and purchase these.
Supposing government subsidizes drugs so that people can get it cheap, you will then have, I would estimate, 40 to 50 million heavy users of drugs in the United States.
Tonight, which way is the best way to win the war on drugs?
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
If you're confused by the conflicting claims of those claiming progress in or failure for the war on drugs, you have good reason. Only 2 days ago, one of the top officials of the Drug Enforcement Administration told a Senate panel that the drug situation in the Western Hemisphere is at its worst level ever. And the DEA cites a compelling piece of economic evidence, the price of cocaine. Since 1982, when the street price of a kilo was $45,000 to $55,000, the price has dropped. Depending on quality, the range last year was $10,000 to $40,000 a kilo. As with all goods, the price goes down when a product is more easily available. And yet, there is another factor that drives prices down, decreasing demand. In 1985, 5.3 million Americans used cocaine. Currently, the number is down to about 1.3 million. There is a similar positive long-range trend in the use of marijuana. 10.7% of our high school students admitted using marijuana back in 1978. Last year, that percentage was down to 3.6. Nothing, however, is ever quite as clear as it seems. We hit a low point in drug use back in 1990, 91, and 92. The numbers are creeping back up again. Up for marijuana and LSD. Up this past year for cocaine and crack. Earlier this evening, my colleague Catherine Cryer presented a program which focused on the merits of decriminalizing drug use. Here are a few of the voices that were heard.
Drug usage is not illegal in the Netherlands. The usage is not prohibited by law.
In small doses and in pure composition, heroin is, according to textbook, a remarkably safe drug.
This is a deadly and poisonous activity. People should be imprisoned for long periods of time for doing it. It's a matter of right and wrong.
A lot of users are not criminal. They use their quantity every day. A lot of them are working. What we fight is against the dealers, the traffickers, the organized crime, and very hard.
if young people are interested in taking drugs, with this system, they can just buy it in a more or less open atmosphere. There's no secrecy. So they are not forced to get into contact with all criminal figures who are more interested in offering hard drugs to them, who are more addictive.
At the end, we have to legalize it because more police, more courts, more prisons, overheating all these institutes, they don't solve the problem. They didn't, and they will not.
Statistics show that this policy works because the number of hard drug users has stabilized for more than 10 years.
If we have a patient presenting to our clinic who is injecting heroin and who makes it clear that he's not yet ready to stop injecting and he's not yet ready to stop taking opiate drugs, we are willing to accept that and willing to provide for those people controlled amounts of pharmaceutical heroin.
Because I've had this prescription, I've been able to get my life back in order, so that prescription has given me a second chance.
We are willing to prescribe heroin to buy time, to get them out of criminal behavior, to get them to be physically and mentally well, to get them to be functioning in society.
Heroin maintenance is a bust, and any treatment that is looking at fixing a complicated human problem from a pure pharmacologic and drug method, that we're going to fix this mess by adding a drug, is doomed to failure.
Show me a junkie who can't quit and who's at risk of AIDS and who's committing crimes. Let's reduce that crime. Let's reduce that AIDS. Let's reduce the vulnerability to disease. Let's try to help him get his life together. If that means providing him with heroin or morphine or injectable methadone, then we should do that.
You will never persuade the citizens of this country, never, that they should legalize drugs.
Could we, should we even try to make that argument? Joining us now, some people who've spent many years grappling with the question. From our New York bureau, James Burke. He is the chairman of the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, which is a public service campaign against drugs. Joseph Califano is the president of the Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University. He was health secretary during the Carter administration. And from Baltimore City Hall, we're joined now by a leading advocate for drug decriminalization, Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke. Gentlemen, let me begin by making a proposition and getting your reaction to it. And Mr. Burke, let me get it from you first. Absolutism of any kind on either side of this issue is doomed to failure.
Yes, I think that's true. I can't argue with that, and I think that maybe we've finally begun to look at this issue in a way that will allow us to learn from our own experience, and not necessarily what's going on outside the United States, about what works and what doesn't work.
Are you saying that what goes on outside the United States is necessarily doomed not to work in the United States, or are you saying it doesn't work outside?
No, first of all, I don't think it does work outside, but I think that we can learn a lot more than we have so far, particularly in this piece that we just saw, in terms of what works in the United States. I am glad to hear you talk about the dramatic reductions in demand in the United States. I'm sorry that wasn't covered in the Catherine Cryer piece previously, because I think to do this thing out of context is very demotivating to the people who are working so hard to solve the problem all over the country, and in many cases are solving.
Well, let's see if we can keep it in context then. Mayor Schmoke, maybe you would just react to the initial statement that I made.
Right. Well, I'm glad you didn't frame the question as to whether we should legalize or not legalize, because I think that would be absolute positions, and that is really not the issue. I think that what Mr. Burke has said is correct about use. There is a sense that demand is going down, but at the same time, hardcore addiction has been going up. AIDS is going up, violence related to drug distribution. And so I think what we have now is an opportunity for people at various spectrums of this debate to say, look, things that we have been doing really are not solving the problem. By solving the problem, I mean not just looking at demand, but looking at violence and AIDS related to drugs. And so now we have an opportunity to open up our minds to different approaches, and I think that there should be a mix. Law enforcement has its place, the health services have its place too, and that's why I think that the war on drugs should be primarily a public health war rather than a criminal justice war.
Let me just get an opening reaction from Mr. Califano, then we'll take a break and really engage.
Ted, I think, one, I do not think drugs should be legalized. If that's an absolute position, so be it. I do think that we have to do a lot of different things in the war on drugs. I think there are things we can do that we haven't done. We need more treatment. We ought to take the captive audiences in prison that have drug and alcohol problems and treat them. And we ought to recognize that overseas we do have some lessons. In the Netherlands, marijuana use has gone up 250% over the time they've had this policy. Amsterdam has more police proportionately than the average city in the United States, and property crime is way up over there. In England, most of the people, the 400 people that were referenced in the show earlier, are on methadone, not on heroin. 80% of the people are unemployed. There are 150,000 heroin addicts in Britain, and picking an isolated situation of 400 doesn't reflect that. And to say, as they indicated on the show, incidentally, that drug dealers are folding up their tents in England would be considered preposterous, I think, by any policeman or public health
Let us
official
take
there.
a break, and let me ask each of you, rather than re-debating a program that was on earlier this evening, let's see if we can just focus on the argument on this program tonight. We'll be back in just a moment.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Visa.
And we're joined once again by Jim Burke, Joe Califano, and Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke. Mr. Burke, a couple of years ago, you and I had a lengthy discussion in which I suggested to you that it was my opinion that we are focusing too much attention on law enforcement, too much attention on satisfying the political imperatives of sort of public opinion, and perhaps not enough time, not enough effort, not enough money on drug education and helping people to break drug addiction. At the time, my recollection is that you agreed. Do you still?
Yes, I do. I don't consider myself an expert on the law and order piece, but I would like to, if I could, in response to that, Ted, frame the issue differently, perhaps, which fits your comments. I think because there is so much crime and violence spawned by the drug problem, the country has a tendency to think at the terminal end of the system and worry at the terminal end of the system, as well they should be. But if we think about the issue differently and start from where it begins, which is with children, with our kids, 90% of all of the current heavy users of drugs in America started in their teens. Over half started before their 16th birthday. I think it's important that we try to reposition ourselves in looking at what we should be doing next, and I agree very much with what Mayor Schmoke has said, that we've got to look at new ways to improve what we're doing. I think if we look at it through the eyes of our children and what their needs are, I think we may come up with a whole different set of answers.
That, in fact, is what a great many of our friends south of the border are saying. The folks in Colombia who are saying, hey, if there weren't this great demand up north, we wouldn't be shipping all that cocaine through Mexico and into the United States. I see you nodding your head, Joe Califano.
Well, I mean, we are 6% of the world's population in the United States. We consume 50% of the world's cocaine. I do think, in response to your question, Ted, we really do have to do a lot of things differently. I mean, one, we have to, with people on welfare or receiving federal benefits that have drug and alcohol problems, we should condition those benefits on those people getting treatment and help, and we should give them treatment and help.
Let me stop you right there. We don't have the money for treatment and help. We're closing down centers. In fact, if I may just interrupt you for 1 second to go to Kurt Schmoke. Mr. Mayor, in Baltimore, do you have the money in your budget for all the drug treatment centers you need?
Absolutely not. We've got a city of about 730,000 people, and we estimate that we have 48,000 cocaine and heroin addicts. And the other thing that you know, I know some of these issues are long range, but people want some answers now. We've been doing this war on drugs since 1914, and for me, one of the big issues is that we have to have a national policy that takes the profit out of distributing drugs at the street level, because it's the profit that drives the crime. It's not just people ingesting a substance and going crazy. It's a war out here, war over money, and until we come up with a way of taking the profit out of distributing drugs on the street level, we're going to have this continued violence, and that's what's plaguing America's
Now,
cities.
that's where things are likely to blow up, I suspect, because when you talk about taking the profit out, that's another way, Jim Burke, of saying decriminalizing. If you decriminalize, you take the profit out, so why not?
The problem with all the decriminalization methods that I've listened to neglect the fact that there are children out there who are the users. If you make it less criminal, is being suggested here, for adult users, that means that the dealers have got to go after children. Nobody wants to decriminalize it for children. At least I haven't heard anyone suggest that we decriminalize it for children. So if you take the profit out of it for adult use, you're just going to take people who sell drugs are just going to spend a great deal more time on our children.
Ted, can I just add? Can
No,
I
I'm
just
sorry.
add something? Let me just make a couple of points here that I think are very, very important. One, with respect to drugs, if you will, cigarettes and alcohol, which are widely available to adults, the fact is we don't keep them away from children. We have 3 million children smoking in this country. We have 8.5 million high schoolers drinking. Number two, we do have experience. In Zurich, they tried Needle Park. It went from a few hundred to 20,000 when they gave out needles and they gave out heroin, and they had to close it down.
But that wasn't, Italy, come on now, you know
wait a second,
that wasn't
Kurt,
health regulated.
Kurt,
that was, they let them come into the park and kill themselves.
Kurt,
you know that's not what I'm talking
Kurt,
about.
let me just finish. In
Okay.
Italy, in which heroin has been decriminalized since 1975, it has the highest number of heroin addicts, 350,000 per population of any country in Europe. I think we have seen experience like that. In Sweden, where they did give it out by prescription, they backed off because the prescriptions they gave out were handed to other people. Sweden now has a drug-free Sweden policy in which we have seen a dramatic decline in the first use of drugs by children and teenagers, which as Jim Burke says is where it's at.
Let me just jump in. Mr. Mayor, I know you want to come back, and it's only fair that you should. And when we do, I'd like you to come back on the issue that Mr. Burke made a moment ago, the issue that we're going to be driving drugs towards our children, illegal drugs.
Sure.
Would you consider that point? And we'll be back with that answer in just a moment. And we're back with Joe Califano, Jim Burke, and Kurt Schmoke. Mr. Mayor, you were going to respond to the point that Mr. Burke was making a moment ago, that to the degree that we decriminalize for adults, we push the illegal trade toward our children.
Yeah, I don't think that that necessarily would occur, but my view is that the heavy public education aspect of this program that I think Mr. Burke supports should be targeted mostly at the young people. I think that that's where you would be most effective and really have the greatest impact. What I'm suggesting is that you can divide up our drug problem in kind of 3 areas. The treatment area, where some people will respond to treatment, and if we have more of it, then we can take care of that portion there. There's a portion that have to be prosecuted. Those who import the substances into our country, that's legitimate for prosecution. And then there's a third element of people who use the substance, who don't care about prosecution, who don't care about treatment, and we've got to figure out what we're going to do with these people. And I'm simply suggesting on one aspect of this is maintaining these people on a substance through the public health system. I mean, that is a matter that should be open for discussion. I just hope that we are now at a point where we believe with most of America that the current war on drugs is a failure in need of substantial change, and that we together can sit down and come up with some new options that'll move us forward.
You, Mr. Burke, do not believe that it is a failure.
No, I do not. Quite the contrary. If you stop and think about the figures, we've reduced overall drug usage by 50% in 8 years. 8 years. That's more than we've reduced cigarettes in this country in a generation.
Yeah, but Mr. Burke, you would agree that even the federal government says that even though the line on drug use, overall drug use is going down, that hardcore addiction is going up, and that AIDS related to drugs and that violence related is going up.
Could I just make, I don't think we've really had a serious war on drugs. If this disease that afflicts millions of Americans were cancer or diabetes, we would have massive research efforts. We don't have them to make treatment better, to make prevention better. We would have massive treatment on the level we have for those diseases. There's a tremendous stigma to this.
Mr. Califano, let me jump in on that point, because I think one of the reasons we don't have the massive treatment is because we don't have the massive dollars, because it's easier for politicians to get dollars for law enforcement and for new jails than it is for drug treatment centers.
I think that's true, Ted. I think there's another problem here, and we ought to get it on the table, and that is race. I think people look at the drug problem as sort of a black problem. It's up there in Harlem. It's out in Southeast Washington. We tolerate drug bazaars in Harlem and Southeast Washington that we would never permit on the streets of Georgetown or the Upper East Side. We don't have equal law enforcement in
And
this
yet the
country.
vast preponderance of admissions to emergency rooms for emergency drug treatment, not black, not Hispanic, but white.
Yes, and let's also, if I may, 2/3 of all drug users go to work every day. There's so many myths about this business because of the fact, I believe, Ted, that the media also has not done its job in educating the public to where we've been, where we are, and where we need to go. I think there's a remarkable agreement between the three of us that we have to look at where we've been, learn from where we have been, and do things differently, and do a lot more.
I couldn't agree more. I would just hope that, you know, we could say, you know, folks, if this war has been going on, or maybe it hasn't been going on aggressively enough, it's time for folks who really care about this to sit down and say, how do we get to a peace table in this battle? And it's probably going to end up with a variety of strategies, and hopefully people will understand now that it can't just be more lock them up and throw away the key. We lock up some and target some of the predators on our society, but for the vast portion of this problem, it's got to be a public health approach that's going to really resolve the problem.
Closing thought, please, from Jim Burke and then Joe Califano.
Well, my closing thought is, whatever we do, let's stop talking about the fact that we've lost the war, because that demotivates everybody and makes people look to solutions that aren't going to solve anything. And in the process, let's remember that everything that we do sends a signal to our children. If we make it more permissive for adults, children read that very quickly as they have on cigarettes and alcohol and say, well, maybe it's okay for me.
Joe Califano.
Ted, let me put it this way, two things. One, we know that if we can get someone from 10 to 20 without using drugs, without getting involved in any of this stuff, without smoking cigarettes, they're virtually certain to be home free for the rest of their life. So let's focus on those teenage kids. And number two, let's all of us point out that what's happening inside that beltway on the halls of Congress, more prisons, more concrete, with no treatment when 80% of the people in prison are there for drug and alcohol-related crimes, is an absolutely insane policy. We have to find the resources. We find resources for all kinds of stuff in this country. Let's find resources for what I consider to be public health enemy number one, substance abuse.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you also for the civil nature of the conversation. Not easy to keep it civil on this subject, but I appreciate your efforts. Thanks so much. I'll be back in just a moment. Tomorrow on 2020, new sex charges and the military. Air Force cadets forced to submit to physical attacks. It's called rape scenario training. That story tomorrow night on this ABC station. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
America as a nation has never been afraid. But today, too many individual Americans are afraid of violence in our streets, our schools, even in our own homes. What can we do? We can stop the drug use that fuels violent crime and puts all of us at risk. Thousands of communities all across America are working now to end the nightmare of drug abuse and the violence it feeds. Please support the effort in your neighborhood and help return us to our better selves.
teacher tells us all we gotta do is just say no. And the other day, a policeman came to our class talking about say no too. Well, my teacher doesn't have to walk home through this neighborhood. And maybe the dealers are scared of the police. But they're not scared of me. And they sure don't take no for an answer.
To Kevin Scott and all the other kids who take the long way home, we hear you. Don't give up.
Every single scientific study that has been done in the last several years shows alarming increases in the toxicity and the danger of using marijuana. All illegal drugs are dangerous. We have to drive down usage again. It has got to be not a good thing to do, not a cool thing to do. It is a stupid thing to do as well as an illegal thing to do, and I want you to help bring it back down. All illegal drugs are dangerous. We have to drive down usage again. It is not a good thing to do, not a cool thing to do. It is a stupid thing to do as well as an illegal thing to do, and I want you to help bring it back down. All illegal drugs are dangerous. It is not a good thing to do. It is a stupid thing to do as well as an illegal thing to do, and I want you to help bring it back down.
I'm Peter Jennings. If you have a child, if you have a friend, if you're growing up, if you think you're smart, we think you'll want to see what's on this tape. It is filled with very brief but very powerful images about one of the most destructive forces in our society. It has destroyed so many families. We're talking about illegal drugs, and we would like you to treat this as something of a video chain letter. The more people who receive this, the more lives we think will be saved. First, some essential facts. Drug use among adolescents had been going down for more than a decade. Now it is going up again. Across the country, more teenagers are getting high on marijuana, on LSD, hallucinogens, and inhalants. While drug use among young people remains far below historic levels, leading national research shows a very disturbing trend. Among teenagers, there has been a change in attitude. A change for the worse. Teens are increasingly viewing drugs as less dangerous and more socially acceptable. Of course, that attitude is driving more teens to try these very dangerous substances. Other facts. Nearly half of all men arrested for violent crime in America test positive for illegal drugs. Drugs play a role in escalating health care costs, the spread of AIDS, homelessness, and domestic violence. In the workplace, employees who abuse drugs are costing American businesses billions of dollars every year in lost productivity and accidents. After all, most drug abusers are not sleeping on the street. 2/3 of them are employed. But no, the news is not all bad. We believe the number of regular drug users overall is down by more than 50%. Regular use of cocaine has dropped by an astonishing 70%. One major reason is that Americans are taking a more active role than ever in the war against drugs through community-based coalitions. There were an estimated 2,500 drug-fighting coalitions throughout the country now. 2,500. And what the experts have realized is that one of the most effective weapons there is against drug abuse is you. It is organizations made up of people like you, organizations like this one, the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, that are really working at it. I must tell you, it needs your help. You have probably seen a number of the partnership's anti-drug ads. Many of them are on this tape. Sometimes the most difficult thing in the world is to sit down with somebody you love and tell them the truth. We think this tape will help. So I hope you'll watch it, and we hope you'll share it. I'm Peter Jennings.
In case you've forgotten how big America's drug problem is, here's a little reminder.
Tito, since I'm your friend, this one is free.
No, I better not.
Tell you what, guess which hand it's in, and it's yours. What do you say?
I don't know.
But are we friends or what? Come on.
Okay.
Hey, it's your lucky day.
I better not. Look, I have to go.
A friend who offers you drugs is not your friend. Don't fall in the trap. Don't do drugs.
Statistics show that 46% of all kids who smoke marijuana are inner city youth. Guess who the other 54% are?
Hi, KB. Who are your friends?
My dog Donut, my buddy Marty.
Hey, Kitty, what's up?
My classmate Ocean. Oh, yeah, there's Kelly. She's okay.
Hi, I'm Kai.
Who are not your friends?
Well, there's these two guys at school, Jesse and Jeff. Jeff does drugs, and he tries to get us to do it, too. Jesse thinks he's cool because he hangs out with Jeff.
Hey, guys, want to have some fun?
No, thanks, man.
Yeah, get a life, guys.
Hey, man. Want to taste of something make you feel good?
Leave me alone.
Try it out. You don't know what you're missing. A little crack won't hurt you.
It'll make me a crackhead.
Won't cost you nothing. This one's on me. Absolutely free.
I said no, man.
Good job, son. That's just what you do if that ever happens.
Okay, Dad.
Deal with your kids. Tell them the truth about drugs. It could be the most important role you ever play.
Like how you handled yourself.
You are the thumbs and the eyes. You are the energy and the shine. You are the rhythm and the gift. You are the angel and the fist. You are the universe. You are the universe.
Is cocaine crack or is crack cocaine?
You were going to talk to her?
You were going to talk to her.
I think it's time that we had a little talk. We'll talk about it later.
No, it's time. It's important.
If you had any questions you wanted to ask me, honey, you would ask your father, wouldn't you?
Right.
I'm just going to tell my kid that if he ever tries it, I'll kill him. All right?
That's sensitive, Al. If you need help talking to your kids about drugs, call for this free book.
Last night, Lisa Watson got higher than she's ever been. And the only thing she took was first place.
And here comes Chris Hill, 4'6" out of Jefferson Elementary, a confident young man with a great stride. But, uh-oh, he might be in trouble now.
Hey, Chris. Want to get high? No way, man. That stuff's for losers.
Oh, what a move! Chris Hill never hesitates, just blows past that guy. Bob?
You're right, Mike. Look, Chris is known for his great head shake. Then he shifts his weight to the right foot, finds a hole, and zip, he's out of there.
Spectacular, just spectacular. This kid's got a bright future.
It's yours?
No, I'm...
Mother said she found it in your closet.
I don't know. One of the guys must have...
Must have what?
Look, Dad, it's not...
Where did you get it?
Dad,
Answer me. Who taught you how to do this stuff?
You, all right? I learned it by watching you.
Parents who use drugs have children who use drugs.
My teacher tells us all we gotta do is just say no. And the other day, a policeman came to our class talking about say no too. Well, my teacher doesn't have to walk home through this neighborhood. And maybe the dealers are scared of the police. But they're not scared of me. And they sure don't take no for an answer.
To Kevin Scott and all the other kids who take the long way home, we hear you. Don't give up.
I don't know how you felt watching those commercials, but I was staggered by the intelligence of them, the artistry of them, and the effectiveness of them. And I wanted to applaud after each one. I didn't because this is a strange context, you know, press conferences. These are not rallies, and they're not campaigns, and you're not really supposed to express yourself that way. But I feel so frustrated that I didn't. I'm going to give myself and all of you a chance to express your own feeling about those commercials. If you think they were great commercials, just join me with some applause. You do these free, right? These guys do them free, these guys and gals from Madison Avenue. Do they do political work? They're awesome. You saw the product of their genius and their inspiration, because you don't do that half-heartedly. You can't do that kind of work half-heartedly. I don't care how good you are. You can't produce that kind of art if you don't really feel it. You could be Michelangelo. If you didn't feel like working, you wouldn't be able to get David out of that stone. It's as simple as that. So these people did it with a powerful inspiration. I think the truth is we have not made nearly enough progress. We have not made the progress that we have all the capacity to make. We have not begun to try as hard as we should, certainly not at the national level. I think the state has done reasonably well, probably better if you measure it by investment, and I'll get specific in a moment, than any state in the union. But I don't think we come near what we need to do on this subject. And I'm sure that as a nation, we're not coming near what we need to do. And I think something is happening that's very frightening. I think that the truth is that much of the country doesn't want to admit it's a problem, and that much of the country feels it's not their problem. The most effective commercial I saw from my own personal experience up there was the 46% and the 54% or whatever the numbers are. That's the best. that commercial with those nice, blonde, white kids, apparently not from the inner city, and saying to all of America, it's not just the kids in South Jamaica. It's not just the kids in Harlem. It's not just the kids from the neighborhood that you moved out of. You can't move away from it. It's not like that. And it isn't. But I think the country thinks it is. And I think, frankly, the people in the higher classes, economically more comfortable, people like myself, I think the tendency is to think that this is a syndrome that you escaped when you left the neighborhood, and that is either preordained and beyond your capacity to deal with, or not worth your trouble. And so you see a whole series of syndromes like choice in education, which is one way of saying let's go to the private schools and heck with the public schools, because it's not worth investing in the public schools anymore, presumably because I don't have to use them anymore, and let's legalize drugs, which is exactly the same syndrome. Incidentally, they don't tell you which drugs and under what circumstance. What they're really saying, a lot of these people, is I don't want to have to deal with it. I don't want to have to pay for it, and my kid will escape it. Now, that may be a harsh assessment. If it is, I apologize for my lack of understanding of this issue. But this is something I've come to over many, many years, talking to all the brightest people I can find, much brighter than I and much more knowledgeable than I. And I think this country cannot say at this point that it's really trying to fight guns and drugs. Really? How come you still have assault weapons? How come he has to do all the television free? Why aren't we spending $5 billion a year? Why don't we call in Larry Tisch? Why don't we call in Jack Welch of NBC? Why don't we call in Ted Turner? Why don't we call Murphy, who's from Albany and a terrific guy, and ABC, and say, hey, look, these guys are schlepping for nothing. They're working. And you're giving us some time, and we thank you. But this is an attack from outer space. They're destroying a whole generation of young people. They're killing our children. Why don't we spend $5 billion? I'll give you $5 billion out of the national treasury. We'll buy prime-time television. Every night it'll be on, so that the kids will not be able to escape it. And when they cannot escape it as they're watching their television 6.5 hours a day, what they will say to themselves is, this must be important. Because they're insisting, I see it every night in prime time. This must be important, because to many children, unlike me, I didn't have television. I had books. And you could select the books. And so you weren't commandeered by your society. You chose your own path. There wasn't just one book to read. They didn't lay a book in front of you every day and say, read it for 6.5 hours. You could read The Well of Loneliness and learn from Radcliffe Hall all about lesbianism if you wanted to. Or you could read about St. Francis of Assisi, or economics, or Greece, or anything in the world. Or take down the encyclopedia and pick your subject. Football, aardvark. You can't do that of your kid now. They give you the book. They open it for you. They put it out there in television. And what are we writing on its pages? Well, the partnership, thank God, is doing a lot of good work. Why aren't we insisting that we do more? What would you do if it was really in your house, God forbid, if you had 5 kids? It was really in your house. You're the mama, you're the papa, or one of the two. And these are your children, not somebody else's kids, really yours, in the house. One of them on drugs, gone. And you know it, doing every kind of terrible thing. And every time you see a story on television about some kid who's in trouble or some terrible thing that happened, you know that could be your son. How about if you thought your daughter was hooked? What she might be doing with her body? How would you deal with it? How would you treat it? How would you say, oh, hey, the hell with this, pardon the vernacular, let's legalize it. What would you do? Oh, well, it's enough. It's enough to use Bonnet and the volunteers. I mean, we don't have to take any money out of the budget. I don't want to pay any more in taxes. I don't want my kids having to be, let them choose what they want on television. What would you say if it was your son, your daughter, or 2 of them? Or if it was your son who was killed by somebody who was out of his mind looking for crack money and just wasted your son, one of 3 that you lost in 3 years within 200 feet of the front door of your housing project, like Mrs. Davis, who came here this summit and told us about it. We know that they can't be protected just by law enforcement. We know that if it were our family and our house, we'd insist on a cop on every block and a cop by the school and locking up those drug dealers and sending them away forever and throwing away the key, absolutely. The toughest law enforcement you can have, and we're going to do that. We are doing it. We have done it. That's why our jails are bursting. You'd insist on that if you were a mother or a father or somebody who loved those kids. But you'd also conclude, as we have, that you can't stop it from the supply side. You can only stop it from the demand side. The prosecutor in Colombia, that heroic figure who was on national television this week, said that to you. He said, if I lock them all up in Colombia, you're not going to be safe in the United States of America. You can't do it that way. They can bring it in the heel of a shoe, or you'll invent a synthetic, as we have in Hawaii. They have something worse than crack, and it's a synthetic. It doesn't have to be imported. They can do it themselves. And you'll do that here. So in the end, the only protection for them is if Emmett Gross is convinced he shouldn't try it. Again, I just want to congratulate all the people who work on this in this state. No state does it better than we do, notwithstanding we don't do it adequately. Starting with Stan Lundeen, Dick Bonet, and all the people he represents in the partnership, there's never been an effort better than yours. This country has never produced a finer, more effective voluntary effort than this one. And I wish I knew the names of all the people who have been involved. And Bob and Mindy and the whole partnership, and the students of St. Casimir's. Thank you very much.